Hi, I'm Stacy LeBlanc, the president of APSAC, and I want to welcome everybody for joining us today, and especially welcome and express my gratitude to our editors and associate editors of our journal, Child Maltreatment, to be here today to Zoom chat with us as we Zoom along on how to write and review and edit for child maltreatment. On behalf of our board, I currently serve as the president, and on behalf of our board, I want to welcome all of you for joining APSAC and for your support for APSAC. We are open and always willing to hear from you about what can we do to bring to you as members. As most of you know, APSAC is a membership society, and we try really hard to translate research from child maltreatment in order to help practice and to strengthen practice. Our membership is growing both nationally and internationally, and we have been truly Zooming along since COVID. So I want to tell you about other opportunities to join us. You can join us coming up soon on other events that we have on to help in training and translating research. Most importantly, I want to ask everyone, if you haven't checked out our agenda, Christy West, and I want to thank her for her continued support as our administrator, has put our agenda on the actual website, so you can go check out everything that we're going to have in New Orleans. We expect more to come, and so please join us, book your room, because the rates are really, really inexpensive, but our block is small this year, so please book your rooms early to reserve your spot. I also want to tell you that APSAC has been Zooming. We have seen an incredible increase, not just in our membership, but also in our registrations. We've reached over 15,000 people who have registered for our trainings virtually since COVID. We continue to have our strength in our publications, and we want to thank all of you for your support and in online engagement. Don't miss the opportunity for our next Zoom chat coming up on March 17th to hear from these leaders who will be premiering a video about parenting in the pandemic. But now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our speakers for today, who are going to take it away, and starting with our editor of Child Maltreatment, Dr. Vince Palusci. So thank you for all that you do. I will stop share, and there you are, Vince. Over to you.
Thank you, President LeBlanc. That is very nice of you to have us here today, and we're very pleased to be talking to this audience about APSAC's flagship journal, Child Maltreatment. I'm Vince Palusci, and I will be starting us off today as we talk about hopefully giving you the nuts and bolts information to understand what the journal is doing, the types of articles we're interested in, how you can write for us, how you can review for us, and maybe even someday edit for us as well. I am going to advance the slides, and we'll have other speakers coming up who we all have the same disclosure that we receive some compensation from APSAC and or the SAGE, the journal, but no other competing conflicts of interest. So just as a reminder, Child Maltreatment is the official journal of APSAC, and our objective is to foster professional excellence in the field by presenting scientific information and technical innovation. So we are truly an academic journal, which has a difference of being composed of multiple fields and multiple different professions, which contribute to dealing with the problem. We're always working on enhancing our articles, advancing the science in the field, and educating all of you. And we understand that all of you are at various stages in your academic careers, be it as a reader of the journal or a person who's considering writing for the journal, or perhaps reviewing and or editing as well. So we understand that we have professionals at different stages of their development, and we think that the early career scientists in particular might benefit most from today's talk, and we're hoping to record it and also provide it with slides down the road for all of us to learn. Our objectives are to review the history of the journal a little bit, and a little bit about how the pandemic has affected our journal as well as others, discuss our policies and procedures for article management, and then our speakers will talk specifically about how to successfully write journal articles in general, as well as for child maltreatment, and what our review process is. So our review also will include deciding on a journal, for your work. We realize that we'd love you to publish in Child Maltreatment, but that may not always be the best journal for your work. So how do you decide on a journal, what to write, what not to write, and then the nuts and bolts and what we do. And we'll have a little time hopefully at the end for discussion. So I'm Vince Palusci. I'm a pediatrician and professor of pediatrics at New York University Grossman School of Medicine. Our other speakers will be Dan Whitaker from Georgia State University School of Public Health, Katie Maguire-Jack from the University of Michigan School of Social Work, and Gio Barboza-Salerno from the University of Colorado Springs School of Public Affairs. And you can see, just like the field, we all come from different professions and disciplines, and we're all obviously focused on child abuse and neglect. So we realize that the field is multidisciplinary. There are advantages to that, in that the knowledge that you write about, what you impart to the field, may have a greater impact, not just in your particular discipline, but also across disciplines. And we know that the system that responds to child abuse neglect, if you can call it a system, is not just one particular field. We realize that because of that, we need all of you in various disciplines to think about this. And APSAC is a perfect home for that, given that it's the nation's largest multidisciplinary professional organization, which focuses exclusively on child abuse. And so if you think about who's on this list, it's psychologists, social workers, physicians, attorneys, law enforcement, nurses, public child protection staff, private child protection staff, researcher, prevention specialists, others, to improve society to our response to child abuse neglect. And we work in the public and private sectors. We function in a variety of roles. Some of us see patients, do research and teach. Some of us limit what we do to one area of that. And APSAC actually provides this context where we can all work together on this common problem. Child maltreatment is our main vehicle for original empirical research, as well as longer and more in-depth analyses of theory, practice, and policy issues. And because of that, we also have to be cognizant of that our readers are not all academic researchers. So those of you who don't do academics, if that's the right way of phrasing that, also should be able to read what's in the journal. And so we do ask our authors to consider those options and make it readable for the non-academician, particularly with regard to policy and takeaway for practice. So we want to combine the complexity and sophistication of the science in the field, but we don't want to become too esoteric or become too localized to one particular field. And that was the vision of Mark Chafin, the first editor of the journal, who started with Volume 1 in 1996 as the founding editor. Mark has left us, but we have multiple past editors-in-chief who are still with us, and we still are working with and managed by APSAC. APSAC has other publications that you can find more about on the website, the APSAC Advisor and the APSAC Alert, which are dealing more with the application of science, but also more, if you will, clinical science, clinical practice for the field. Our journal, Child Maltreatment, publishes primarily original empirical work, quantitative or qualitative and systematic reviews. And we use Sage Publication as our publisher to do lots of things with printing, mailing, marketing, and etc. There's a copyright form that all people go through when they submit their article. And when you look at some recent history for the journal, we went up significantly in our number of submissions in 2020 and 2021 to 267. Overall, about half the articles in last year were rejected without review. Another 23% were rejected after the first review. Overall, about a quarter of the articles made it into publication after submission. The average time to first decision on an article runs about 59 days and approximately 140 days or more to a final decision. Some are more, some are less. But again, in this particular year, the acceptance overall was about 22%. The impact factor, which is a measure of how much the articles are referenced by other articles in the future going forward was 3.051 over 2 years. We still haven't seen the impact factor for 2021 yet. And you can see over 5 years, it was 4.85. The journal is listed in major indexes, including PubMed, PsycInfo, and a whole bunch of other ones applicable to individual disciplines. And overall rankings, which we don't calculate, but which are calculated by a national organization, put us 6 out of 44 in social work and 3 out of 46 in family studies list in 2020. How do we do this with our staff? We have an editorial board which is also multidisciplinary in nature. They get renewed now fairly frequently, every 5 years. Half of the editorial board will be up for renewal in 2023. We collect information to improve our publication on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we also expect our editorial board members to join APSAC, so they have that multidisciplinary approach to practice as well as academics. We have 4 associate editors, some of whom you'll meet today. We attend quarterly meetings. We look at our individual performance. I also act as an associate editor, and one of our associate editors, who you'll be meeting later, is specifically designated as a statistical editor for complex statistics and methodology. We have a new editorial assistant this spring, Judy Donlin, who, while she's new in coming back, was actually involved starting at least in 2005 with Steve Andersma with the journal. So welcome back, Judy, if you're out there. And she's the one who will be functioning day to day to answer emails to the journal and to deal with questions that she'll refer to the editorial staff as needed. Another thing that we have that you might want to consider in a couple of years is something called Student Editorial Board, where we have a number of editors who are in some part of their training, perhaps pre-doctoral, perhaps postdoctoral, where they do mentored reviews for journal articles. And as Dan Whitaker, our next speaker, will talk about, they do exceedingly great reviews in that process. So if you're submitting an article, you won't know who's reviewing it, but one of your reviews may be coming from a mentored student as well. What kinds of things that we put in the journal? Where do they come from? You can see on the left that when we look at the content by discipline, on the right, we're on the left talking about the primary type of maltreatment, and you can see the blue area being child sexual abuse, and early on in the journal's history, a significant percent, maybe half, were related to child sexual abuse. You can see that that's come down over the years. We've had an increase in physical abuse articles, neglect articles, and some emotional maltreatment articles over the years. On the right, you can see it's psychology predominantly, where the lead author in the papers over the years, but that's also come down. We've also increased our authorship by social work, or then also medicine and public health, and then criminal justice. Our articles of the year represent the finest articles in a particular volume as determined by an editorial board. And you can see things here which include evidence-based service plan guidelines, developmental outcomes in foster care children, prevention using the nurse-family partnership, treatments such as AFCBT, trauma-informed care, termination of parental rights, and we're working on our article of the year for 2021, which should be announced at the APSAC colloquium. We've also had special issues every year or so, looking at things like trauma-informed care, new technology in the field, neurobiologic implications of maltreatment. We have currently an open call for papers still related to COVID-19, and it turns out to have increased the number of publications being submitted to us. And what we found is that these articles need to move quickly through the system. 144 days is a long time for an article in which the science is rapidly changing, and our understanding of COVID, as you all know, was very rapidly changing early on in the pandemic. So we're looking at expediting those reviews through the system as we continue to try to understand its effects on child abuse neglect. We also recently put out the intersection of intimate partner violence and child maltreatment with Dan Whitaker as one of the editors. And we are going to have a special collection on medical and health-related issues in May of this year. And in 2023, legal issues in child maltreatment with editors Ted Cross, Frank Vandervoort, and Stephanie Block. So as one of the things that we're doing as well as other journals in the field, as well as APSAC overall, is making specific steps, changes, if you will, to make sure we're addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Clearly, in academics, in publication, and articles, and methodology, we're discovering much of what we've been doing has particular areas of focus, and it really is not diverse, equitable, or inclusive. And what we're trying to do is change that, at least in the publication we call Child Maltreatment. We can't change the scientific enterprise. We can't change the research that's going on, but we can work with authors and we can work with editors and reviewers to be sure that we address these issues. And you'll be seeing some policies and procedures and commentaries coming out from APSAC and the journal in the next few months. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dan Whitaker, who's going to talk about publishing your work in child maltreatment. And Dan, I'll let you introduce yourself with a little bit of information if you'd like.
Sure. Thanks, Vince. Can everyone hear me okay? Or can anyone hear me okay? I'll take that as a yes.
I can hear you, Dan.
Okay, good. Thanks for joining. I'm Dan Whitaker. I'm a faculty at Georgia State University in the School of Public Health. I was editor-in-chief of child maltreatment from 2014 to 2020. I was thrilled to do it and thrilled to pass it off to Vince. So next slide, please. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is why publish in a journal at all. If you've got an article, if you've got some findings, some people this is not an activity that's of value to them, and hopefully I can convince you that it should be. There are several reasons. One is to increase the visibility and the reach of your work. If you don't put it out there, people can't read it. The peer review process could actually help you greatly improve your work. None of us like everything the peer reviewers have to say, but I think when we step back and look at the commentary, it's often quite valuable. Publishing will also establish ownership of your work and help you verify the quality of the work to others. If something is published, it has an increased air of quality and believability to it, so that's important. Finally, it allows you to secure a permanent archive of your work. And so as long as there's an internet and a child maltreatment, your work will be accessible to others without having to necessarily go through you. Finally, the last one is to have a voice in engaging with others through the peer review process about debates, ideas, and challenges to existing ideas. And again, the peer review process can be painful sometimes, but often I think in the end, it really makes you think about your own work, and acting as a peer reviewer helps you think about other people's work. So it's very valuable. Next slide, please. So in thinking about, Vince alluded to this, and thinking about where to publish your work, you really have many choices if you're working in the area of maltreatment. There are lots of different kinds of journals that publish articles on child maltreatment. And I just want to frame a little bit of those for you, because in my experience as an editor, sometimes we would get articles that, I would read the article and say, yeah, this isn't a bad article, but we're really not the right choice for it. And so thinking about this, there are discipline-specific journals that will publish work in child maltreatment. These come out of psychology, medicine, public health, social work, law and policy. We all know that child maltreatment is an interdisciplinary field of study, but within the disciplines, many of the journals that are discipline-focused will also publish child maltreatment work. So there are those journals, and then there are interdisciplinary journals. So what I mean by this is there are violence-specific journals like the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, Violence and Victims, Journal of Family Violence. Then there are child maltreatment-specific journals, and this is where I would put child maltreatment. So there's child maltreatment, child abuse and neglect, child abuse review, lots and lots of choices. There are population-focused journals, that is, journals that are focused on adolescents, for example, Journal of Adolescent Health, or women's issues, Journal of Women's Health. And so this is another choice, another outlet that you sometimes see child maltreatment related work. Finally, there are journals focused on methods such as prevention science is an example, or implementation studies. Implementation science is an example of that. Or if you've got an epidemiology journal, study of child maltreatment, there are epidemiology journals. So there are lots of choices depending on where you want to put your work. Next slide, please. in thinking about this, it's important that you write your article so that it's going to be received well by the journal that you're submitting to. You don't write an article and decide where to submit it. I think you should have a good idea of where you're submitting it when you're writing it, because you have to write it for that audience. So discipline journals may lean toward relevance for their field. For example, psychology journals tend to be more theoretical. Clinical psych journals want to have relevance to clinical conditions. Social work journals tend to be a little bit more practice oriented, and public health and medical journals tend to favor impact. They like larger samples, harder outcomes, more external validity. As I mentioned, framing your findings to the journal's orientation is very important. This is not something that is explicit in journal author instructions, but something that you come to know as somebody who publishes often. So if you're not someone who publishes often, now you know. My advice to you is if you're looking at a particular journal, read some of the articles. That sounds silly to say, but as editor, I would occasionally get an article and I'd look at it and say, has this person ever read Child Maltreatment? So read the articles, look at how much theory is in there, look at what kinds of outcomes they favor, and so on. Next slide. Okay, more things to consider when choosing a journal. We just talked about the focus. This is a discipline-specific study you're doing. That is it very sort of, again, I'm a psychologist, so I'll use that as an example. Is it very psychology-oriented, maybe individually focused, very theoretical? Is the article itself very theoretical versus applied? And so those are considerations. Vince mentioned the journal impact factor. Now, higher is better. Higher means that generally more people are reading and citing the work. There's a link in there that talks about, links to an article that talks about impact factors. Higher impact factor journals are generally more competitive, and so you may have a harder time getting your work published in a journal with an impact factor above 3 or 4, say. Another consideration: who is the audience for the journal? Who do you want to reach? And most of the major journals now are indexed, and so somebody who wants to find work in your area is going to be able to find it. But sometimes there are regular readers of a journal, like, for example, Child Maltreatment is part of the APSAC membership. So there are child maltreatment practitioners who get it. Now, do they read it? We don't know, but at least they get it. Regular versus open access journals. Regular journals are print journals. You can publish in them. There's no fees. You likely have to wait a year or so for your journal to actually become available in paper. Open access journals, there are more and more of these proliferating. They typically carry a publication fee. They don't produce print copies, but in this day and age, I think fewer and fewer of us are keeping print copies. We're just keeping things electronically. Open access journals typically charge between $1,000 and $3,000 to publish. Just a note of caution: beware of predatory journals. There's a link to an article that talks about some of those. These are typically open access. They have relatively low fees. They do a lot of solicitation. I must get 10 emails a week from journals asking me to send their work. They promise high quality peer review within days, which is an oxymoron. You don't get high quality peer review within days, period. And these journals really have low credibility. Yes, you can put them on your Vita, and yes, you can send people links, but in the scientific community, they have relatively low credibility. So that link will tell you, well, how do I know if something is a predatory journal or not? Next slide, please. Just a few other thoughts about choosing a journal. Read the journal's aims and scopes, read the author instructions, look for page limitations. I think we've all done this. You write a 40-page paper, and it turns out the journal's only allows for 30 pages, and you end up having to cut a quarter of your content. Look at where the papers you are citing, where are those papers being published? Because you know that that journal at least is interested in the kind of work you're doing. Write the editor, send an abstract or even a draft of the paper. I know as an editor, I would get a lot of these. I liked it because it was a little bit of a gatekeeper. I could tell someone, no, we're not interested in that, and not have to sort of launch them through the peer review process. I've also written editors about my own work and say, are you interested in this? And sometimes I've not gotten a response. So I would say it's worth a shot to send off an email saying, hey, would you be interested in this? Elsevier has a journal finder where essentially you put in your abstract and it makes suggestions. You know, I wouldn't use this as your only criteria, but could give you some ideas. And finally, asking colleagues is always a good idea. Next slide, please. How do you know if child maltreatment is the right choice? So I would say ask yourself these questions. The first one is your article primarily about child maltreatment? Again, this seems very basic, but you know, sometimes we would get articles that were good articles, but they weren't sort of squarely in the relevance box, for example. And I'll use some examples that may not be the best. We would get articles on parenting processes where child maltreatment and sometimes even corporal punishment wasn't necessarily measured. And to me, there are lots of parenting journals that would be a better fit for that than child maltreatment. So child maltreatment is primarily interested in causes, consequence, interventions, practices, and policies around child maltreatment. Second criteria or second bullet there, is your article empirical? Do you have data? Child maltreatment publishes primarily empirical work. If you're writing a theoretical piece, then, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. Is there some theoretical basis to your work, or do you have very strong external validity in that you're using a very large data set, national data, for example, or state level data? Child maltreatment is interested in both kinds of papers, but generally my experience is that you've got to have one or the other, hopefully both, but to be competitive, you've got to have one or the other. The last one is the hardest one. Is your work rigorous? Ultimately, this is going to be the judgment of the peer reviewers and the editor to determine the rigor of of your work. I have always said that there are two basic things that determine whether your paper gets published: its relevance and its rigor. There are probably more than that, but I think those carry the bulk of the weight. What kinds of papers does child maltreatment publish? The manuscript submission guidelines are there. I'll let you read them while I talk. But CM publishes primarily empirical articles. That means there's original data. The data can be quantitative or qualitative. Theoretical pieces are occasionally published, and I mean like very occasionally. So if you have one, I would check with the editor. Commentaries are also occasionally published. Again, check with the editor for their interest in that. Regular research articles are, right now the limit is 32 pages, all inclusive. That's references, tables, text, everything. Brief reports are 14 pages, all inclusive, and review papers can be 52 pages, all inclusive. And I will say we have a strong preference for quantitative reviews that is meta-analysis as opposed to narrative reviews that say, here's a bunch of studies and here's what I think about them. So some quantification of what those studies are finding in some way is helpful. One thing to note is that additional material can be included in an online supplement. So if you've got tables that are maybe not sort of the main thing, but they're helpful for readers to see, there is the possibility of an online supplement. Next slide. In terms of preparing to submit, there's a submission link and a link for questions. Again, read the author instructions, pay attention to the page length, the formatting, and yes, we know you have more to say than fits into 32 pages, but choose what's most important. Use APA style, attend to the page limits and the font. Please use 12-point Times New Roman. And hopefully everyone knows that empirical data that you send to child maltreatment or any journal cannot have been published elsewhere or be under review elsewhere. So you got to do this one at a time. I would say pay attention to your presentation and your adherence to the formatting. You can get away with a little slop, but there's a threshold of sloppiness, and once you cross it, the reviewers and the editor starts to think, gosh, what else is wrong with this paper? And what else is sloppy about this paper? Well-presented data tables can really help the reader understand what you are presenting. So sometimes problems with the data in your paper are not problems with the actual data, but problems in how you are communicating about the data. And so pay attention to your organization. And the best way to do that is have someone else read the paper. We've all got co-authors on our papers, and invite them to be critical. Next slide. So your paper is received. What does the editor look for? I talked about this. Relevance. Is the paper mostly about child maltreatment? Two, is the question important? Is an important question being addressed? Again, theoretical or practical? And is there a unique scientific contribution to this work? I mean, that's it really. Is there a unique scientific contribution, and are the methods rigorous? Finally, one of the other things we think about as editor is who's going to cite this paper? Will this paper be cited? Again, that's an important metric for the journal to keep it sort of at the top of the heap. So we do think about that. Vince mentioned that about half of papers now are rejected by the editor prior to review. Typically, in my experience, this is because of lack of rigor, occasionally lack of relevance. If you get what's called the desk reject, don't feel bad. CM gets a lot of submissions. Vince didn't present data on that, but there are way more submissions and even more good submissions than CM is able to publish. Next slide. Okay, you made it to review. What do the reviewers look for? Briefly by section. In the introduction, I think what you really want to be looking for is there a clear and important research question, and is that research question justified based on the literature? In the methods, again, this is the most difficult part. Do you have rigorous methods? Do you have an appropriate sample? This is generally not college students. I think child maltreatment in the field in general has moved beyond studies about using college students. Do you have appropriate measurement of variables? How are you measuring child maltreatment and/or its outcomes? Is there longitudinal data collection? Now child maltreatment does publish some cross-sectional data collection, but again, I think the field is moving beyond answering etiologic questions with cross-sectional data collection. So longitudinal is definitely preferred. If you have an evaluation study, do you have a comparison group? Preferably randomization, if not a strong quasi-experiment is important. In the results, again, this is a very straightforward thing to say, but do the analyses answer the research questions? You'd be surprised at the number of papers where reviewers say, well, they posed some good questions and then they presented some data, and the way they analyzed them didn't address the question. And so make sure your analyses are aligned with your research questions. And then, are the analyses appropriate? Is the data well presented? I've talked a little bit about that in the past. The biggest problem I see with discussions are two. One is the conclusions that you draw don't necessarily match the results. I think as authors, we have a natural tendency to want to overstate the importance of our results, or even overstate the strength of the results. And then finally, are the limitations of the study noted? After you submit, be patient. The median time to first decision is around 60 days. If you get a desk reject, it'll happen quickly, which is nice. Nobody wants that, but at least it doesn't take 2 months. If you get a review, your paper can either be accepted, rejected, or a revision can be requested. I will say that almost no papers are accepted on the first submission without some revision. So really a revise and resubmit is what you're looking for. If you get rejected, don't despair. This happens to everyone. We've all had plenty of papers rejected. Again, the primary reasons are methodological weaknesses, and again, in my experience, followed by poor justification of the research questions. If you get rejected, don't just turn around and send the paper to the next journal. Look at the reviews. Try to adjust the major points before submitting elsewhere. And this is really, again, a question of your time and what you want to do with your time. I would try to address the most major ones, particularly if they have, if you see more than one reviewer saying the same things. If more than one person says it, then it's a clear weakness. If the criticisms have substance that you can't fix, consider moving down a tier in quality when you resubmit, and that will help you in the next round. Next slide. So if you get reviews and you get an R&R, so what this means is the editors and the reviewers consider your paper potentially publishable. Our R&Rs have a good chance of acceptance, but it's not guaranteed. It really depends on what the questions are and how you address them. Address your comments with the mindset that the editors and reviewers are trying to improve your paper. We've all had the experience where we open our reviews and you start ticking down the things. What are they talking about? I did that, or that's completely wrong. Don't try to take a step back and think about this as somebody trying to help you improve your paper. If a reviewer is wrong about something, it may be because of how you communicated about the issue, not necessarily that they just got something wrong. So I think a big message here is be humble in your communications back. Thank the reviewers for their time. Thank the editors for their time. We've all been peer reviewers, or if you've been a peer reviewer, you know it's time consuming and thankless, so it's nice as an author to show some thanks and humility. Child maltreatment, like most journals, requires you to address all comments in a point-by-point response. Say yes to as much as possible. Point out in your letter where you made changes in the paper. This will help the editor find them, confirm that you made them, and can hopefully help you move through the review process more quickly. If you disagree with a reviewer, be respectful and say why. You may need to bolster your rationale on paper. Again, sometimes the reviewers only have to go on what you tell them in the paper, which is limited by the space you have. And if you're unsure about how to address something, it's fine to ask the editor. Shoot an email saying, hey, this comment came up and I could do this or I could do that, I'm not sure which. And last thing is be prepared for a second revise and resubmit. The second one should be a lot less cumbersome than the first one, but it's pretty common that there's a second revise and resubmit, and then hopefully after that you won't have a third. Thanks. I'm going to turn it over to Gia now, and she'll tell you a little bit more about reviewing.
Hi everyone. I'm Gia Barboza-Salerno. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Public Affairs, and I'm currently the statistical associate editor. And I will talk about the wonderful world of peer review. Manuscripts have been subjected to the peer review process for hundreds of years. The process of peer review involves scholars with similar competencies evaluating the scholarly work of others and is used by almost all scientific journals. Publication in a scholarly journal is the primary method by which new work is communicated, and peer review is an important part of this process. Peer review is to determine whether a scholarly work is suitable for publication in the journal and is vital to quality control, used to determine what's going to be published and what will not. Peer reviewers have differing roles, different expertises, statistical, methodological, and different theoretical and philosophical outlooks that can certainly affect the nature of the review. And peer review may be open, single, or double-blinded. Open is, for example, where the reviewers know the authors know who is reviewing the work, and vice versa. It could also be single or double-blinded. Double-blinded review is when neither the author nor the reviewer knows each other, and that is actually the mechanism by which child maltreatment proceeds. Next slide, please. I'm going to use this graphic to kind of discuss the peer review and publication process. The peer review process begins when you submit an article to the journal. Before submitting, as Dr. Whitaker was saying, it's really important to read the formatting instructions and guidelines to ensure the paper meets the page length, for example, but not only the page length, but other important formatting requirements as well. After submission of the manuscript is logged, and this is where formatting is checked, and receipt of the paper will be acknowledged to you. The manuscript will be read and assessed by one of the journal editors and will either be rejected outright without being sent to external reviewers, and this is what's referred to as a desk reject, or it will be sent out to external reviewers for peer review. It's interesting to note that the peer review process could be really chaotic, where some reviewers say the paper is wonderful, and there's typically one reviewer that gives a more detailed review that's a little bit more critical of the paper. The reviewers are asked to complete the review within a certain time frame. That's the goal. And once the reviews are returned, they'll be assessed by one of the editors who will assign the article, who was assigned to the article originally. And if that editor believes that further review is required, the manuscript will be sent out to external reviewers again, and then this process starts over again. Next slide, please. There are three options that the editor has at this stage if it proceeds. The most favorable option, of course, is that the paper is accepted outright. As was noted before, this is exceedingly rare. If it is, then the paper will go to production, and then it will ultimately go to publication, appearing first online, typically, and then appearing in print. The least favorable option on the left is that the paper is rejected outright. As Dr. Whitaker was saying, we've all experienced this. It's kind of part of this process. A rejection may be accompanied by either an encouragement, perhaps the paper has some strengths, but the methodology is not strong enough, or even sometimes the formatting or the grammar could be strengthened, or it maybe not be encouraged for resubmission after being substantially revised and rewritten. The third option here in the middle is that the article is actually accepted pending revision in light of the external reviewer's comments. The author is provided with the reviewer's comments, revises the manuscript, and then resubmits it. This is what's referred to as a revise and resubmit. The article may be accepted by the editor without further review. This is particularly the case if the revisions were minor. The article may be accepted by the editor without further review, then it will be sent to the article production and publication, or the editor may send the manuscript back out to the external reviewers for further review. And in most cases, this will be the same set of reviewers that originally reviewed the paper in the first place. That's always a really big plus. The reviewers will reassess the manuscript, looking particularly to see if the revisions were made that they suggested. Once the reviews are returned, they will be reassessed by the editors, and either further reviews will be required or further revisions needed. And then the process starts over again. The other option is that the editor accepts the manuscript and then it goes into publication, production, and then publication. Next slide, please. There are 4 major goals of the peer review process. The first one is to help select quality articles for publication. To ensure the goal for the sub goals of this goal is that it helps ensure scientific merit and validity, and as well strong methodology. One of the key questions, for example, would be, has the research that is being reported been carried out well and no flaws in the design or methodology? Another sub-goal is to ensure correct reporting of the work with appropriate acknowledgements, to make sure that the results have been interpreted correctly and that all possible interpretations have been considered. This is particularly important regarding the goals that were discussed earlier by Dr. Palusci with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that the results are not too speculative, but at the same time promote sharing of innovative new research and theories, that the article is relevant to the specific clinical practice, making sure to select work that will be of the greatest interest to readers, and that the journal readers, in fact, are interested in the topic, as well as the clarity of the article itself. Next slide, please. The second goal is to improve the manuscript whenever possible. And I think it's safe to say that the manuscript is always stronger following a really good peer review process, where the reviewers are particularly pointing out some of the flaws of the paper, and you have an opportunity to resubmit your work, to check against malfeasance within the scientific and clinical community, hopefully that's rare, to provide editors with evidence to make judgments about the quality of the work, in particular focusing on whether the article meets the selection criteria for their particular publications. Next slide, please. To conclude, to summarize this process, specific to the journal, papers are submitted. There are different types of papers that could be submitted, either full-length empirical articles, brief reviews, or something else. The paper is either pre-rejected or sent on to refer to further review. The action editor is assigned. In this case, one of the action editors is the associate editor, Drs. Whitaker, Valentino, Hansen, and Maguire-Jack. Then reviewers are assigned. It's important to look for a strong content match. Reviewers who have content knowledge on the topic and have hopefully previous published similar work as the one that you're submitting. The goal is to find 3 reviewers, although that could be really tough, particularly during COVID. I think the reviews were lengthier and it was more difficult to get people to sign on to being a reviewer. It's important to look for methodological and statistical expertise. So oftentimes, if there's a paper that has some advanced statistics, I'll be assigned as the associate editor to review those statistics, and focusing particularly on the statistics, but in light of the whole paper. Reviewers have 30 days by which to submit their review. Frequently, this does not happen. And when it does not happen, the system will send nagging reminders that the review is due. The editor will often as well manually send nagging reminders when he thinks about it. And then the action editor will read the letters and then write decision letters. And now I will hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Maguire-Jack.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barboza-Salerno. My name is Katie Maguire-Jack, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. And I'll be continuing Gia's commentary on reviewing and editing for the Journal of Child Maltreatment. Next slide. So in terms of conducting your review, so what it looks like on our end, when we get a paper in as an editor or associate editor, we're really looking for folks who have a good match to that paper. So oftentimes this is content expertise, sometimes it's methodological expertise, but we're looking for folks that we think would be a good reviewer for that paper that would have the necessary expertise in order to be able to provide a competent review of it. They may not match your content area exactly. So when you get a review request, and let me say thank you so much to everybody who is on this call that has done reviews for us. And thank you to those of you who are considering doing reviews for us. It's such an important part of the process, and it can be really difficult to find reviewers. So when you get a request, it may not match your content area exactly. So sometimes it's hard for us as editors or associate editors to know exactly whether it's a perfect match for you. But if it's a close enough match where you feel that you have the content expertise needed in order to give a good review, then that's okay. It doesn't have to be your very, very specific niche area. So we say, please try to say yes whenever you can. We know that, especially with COVID, that people have a lot of competing interests on their time. And so we understand that not everybody's going to be able to do it. But if you are able and it feels like a good match for you, please try to say yes when you can. As an author submitting papers, you are relying on other folks who are willing to review your paper. And so it's important to sort of repay that favor and be a reviewer for other people. However, if you feel that it's not within your content area when you get that request, it is okay to say no. And it actually is important to say no if you feel that you can't do a good review of it. We do ask for a 30-day turnaround on our papers, and that's because authors are we've all been in this position where you're, waiting to hear back on whether your paper has been accepted or got to revise and resubmit. So even if you can't meet that 30-day turnaround, that's okay. You can let Judy Donlin know. She can adjust the due date. However, we do ask that if you can't do it within 45 days, you should probably say no, because we don't want to leave authors on the hook for months and months and months. Our time to initial decision for reviewed paper was less than 60 days in 2021, as Vince mentioned earlier. Next slide. So you should contact the editor if you have any questions, or if you need help or you need more time. If you're not sure if you potentially have a conflict of interest with the paper, it's always good to reach out and ask those questions, and we're happy to respond to those. So as editors and associate editors, we live and die by two things. The first is the focus appropriate for child maltreatment? And the second is, does the paper contribute anything new scientifically? So the first question should be answered. Most of the time, it should be yes by the time it comes to you, because we do try to filter out and pre-reject the papers that are not a good focus for our journal. But sometimes we miss things. So that's an important question you should be asking yourself when you're reviewing the paper. And then the second one is looking really at the science. So is there a rationale for what they're doing? Are the methods adequate? Are the analyses appropriate? And are the conclusions justified based on the data? So all of the things that Dan was talking about in terms of writing a good paper, this is what you're looking for when you're reviewing the paper. So we have two different boxes when you submit your review. There's confidential comments to the editor, and then there are comments that you will make to the authors that the authors will be able to see. So if you don't understand something, or if something is out of your area of expertise, perhaps you feel comfortable commenting on the paper as a whole, but maybe not the methods specifically, that's something that you could tell us within that confidential comments to the editor. So those are things that you want the editor to see, but not necessarily the author. And what I will say on the other side of this is what's not helpful in those comments to the editor if you say something wildly different from what you put into your comments to the author. So sometimes I have seen where we have a lot of really positive comments to the author and very limited negative things to say. But then in the confidential comments to the author, the reviewer will say something like, this paper is garbage. I mean, I don't think anyone uses those actual words, but this paper is really not suitable for publication. But then the comments to the author really don't match what they said to me privately. And so that can be concerning. So if you have real concerns, please make sure that you put those into the author. Just really briefly, I know we're running out of time here. Reviewers tend to organize their comments in one of two ways. The first being listing it by major issues and minor issues. So major issues being things that you really couldn't consider publishing the paper if they didn't change, and minor issues being smaller things. And then other people organize them by the sections of the paper. So comments on the introduction, comments on the methods, comments on the results, and comments of the discussion. One quick thing is to try to be polite and constructive. As authors who have been on the other side of this, you know what it feels like to get a really negative and really cruel review. So not saying not to point out flaws, because that's absolutely what you should be doing, but just try to be polite and constructive about it. And remember that there's a human on the other end of the receiving of that review. Next slide. So you will have to rate the paper from 1 to 5 on a variety of different things. And then you'll also have to make a recommendation for what you want to do. So if you're recommending that the paper be revised, or you're recommending that the paper be rejected, it is helpful if that recommendation matches the things that you say in your comments to the author, because it is pretty common to get really strong major concerns within the comments to the author. And then the reviewer will say, revise and resubmit encouraging. So those sometimes don't really match up with what you're expecting to see. So really try to think about that, and don't be afraid to say reject. If the paper is not worth publishing, or you think it has some fatal flaws, don't be afraid to say reject. Next slide. So what we're looking for in terms of ethics, we're looking for papers that are not having any of these things. So we're looking for fraud, people making up data or changing data, people who are doing duplicate submissions that are submitting the paper to more than one journal at a time. A duplicate publication would be that it's already been published somewhere else, and now you're trying to publish it again with this journal. Plagiarizing other people's work or plagiarizing your own work. Sometimes people who are newer authors don't realize that you can't cut and paste from previous papers that you wrote yourself, even though it's your own words. It is considered self-plagiarism. So you need to, change up the way that you write things. I know that can be difficult sometimes with things like explaining measures, but you really cannot republish your own work unless you're citing the work that you did previously. And then inadequate citations are a problem. So these are things that we look for as editors, but we also rely on our reviewers to be able to help us with this too. We read as much as we possibly can, but we know that you are reading within the specific niche area that this paper has been published. And so you probably have a better hold on the literature. And so if you recognize that you've read a paper that's really similar to this before, you should let the editor know right away. Next slide. So this Committee on Publication Ethics has some really good tips for peer reviewers. I know that we're really low on time, so I don't want to read these all through to you, but this is something that you can look up as a new reviewer. These are just different things that you should be looking for in the review process. This gives you a lot of different ethical information about conflict of interests, things to include within your peer review, and things to not do. Like you should not be doing, you should not be telling folks that you're reviewing a specific paper. You should not reveal any details about a manuscript before or after the peer review process, except for the things that are released by the journal. So you shouldn't tell someone after the paper is published, like, oh, that was me that reviewed your paper. Those types of things are supposed to be kept confidential. Next slide. You should be objective and constructive in your review. So a lot of the stuff I've already talked about, but just remember that there is a human on the other side of that. So you should refrain from being hostile or inflammatory. It's a reciprocal endeavor. So you should try to do peer reviews whenever you can. And you should be really honest with the journals about your own expertise and knowledge related to the manuscript. So you can look up, again, that's the Committee on Publication Ethics. You can look those up and read those through more carefully, but I wanted to make sure that we left time for question and answers. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Wow, we do have a few minutes for questions. I have it's 12:54 Eastern Time. I believe that we've had some questions in the chat. Most of you have been asking about, will the slides be made available? Will there be a recording? And the answer is yes. If you have another question and you want to put it in the chat right now, I could certainly read it to people, or other participants could. I can tell you that some of the comments we've already talked about is appreciating the issue of self-plagiarism, looking at some of the issues of this process, and are presenting a very realistic view of it. It turns out that, there are a few things that we didn't go into in great depth. And so please feel free to go to the website if there are particular questions, if you want to look specifically at our aims and mission and our submission guidelines. And I should go back to say that the major email address for contacting us is childmaltreatment@apsac.org, but we've also got listed here our individual email addresses. There is a question: if you are a fellow and interested in being part of the review process as a reviewer in training, how do we do that? I did mention, this is Vince Palusci, I did mention the editorial board, student editorial board. That's a very formal process that we set up, and people apply to that. And we currently have a new board that just started this year. But beyond that, we do have faculty members who will mentor you in your division. So let's say that you wanted to review a paper in your area of expertise. I would go to a faculty member in that area and have them reach out to us. Perhaps they're already receiving articles from us to review. We have a process specifically for them to mentor you through it on a case-by-case basis. And if they aren't reviewing for us, they can contact us, and you can contact us, and we can set something up. Another question was, if a manuscript is rejected and the authors revise their manuscript significantly, is it ever appropriate to resubmit a manuscript to the same journal? We did hear from Dr. Maguire-Jack a little bit about this process. Generally, if you get a rejection from this journal, Child Maltreatment, we do not expect or want to see a new submission for a significant revision. That said, there are other journals that will specifically require that or request that. In our letter, we'll be very clear that, unfortunately, we're unable to accept the article. You may see in our revision letter that we're unable to accept it in its current form. And that's when we're saying you can make changes and resubmit it. But that's a different type of letter that you would get from us. We have another question about, what if you are a faculty member who reviews for other journals? How would you want to apply to be a reviewer? Generally, contacting Judy Donlan through the email and letting us know you want to do it. You may already be in our system. We could also distribute you among our associate editors. We're always looking for good people in the field. What's the difference between online and journalistic publication review? This journal is online, but it is still being put into issues, which are still printed on paper. So we are a paper journal that happens to have online articles, and then they're placed into online issues as well. That's our major difference. So we're not just online, and we are not open access. Literally, Sage does have open access options for you. And I believe you can acquire about open access for our journal as well, but we are generally not open access. There's a question about APA guidelines. Yes, we follow APA. Generally, there are some specific differences between us and APA 7. We are more close to APA 6 at this point. But again, that's a question for the editors and Judy Donlan up front. If you have a question, she or the editors will often answer that. Or if we see the paper is not conforming to those guidelines, you will hear from us. I hear we have someone from Argentina. Thank you very much for joining us. We do have most of our articles coming from North America, but we have increasing numbers of international articles. And the major idea for our journal, though, is that remember that we are part of APSAC. And so our audience is focused on the APSAC membership, which is primarily North American. But as you saw from President LeBlanc's map, we do have members across the world. And what the editors are looking for is generalizability to the North American population, not necessarily that it has to come from North America. So we do get submissions from around the world, and that's what we're looking for. And we have South Africa on the line as well. So I hope that we answered most of your questions. We're coming up on the hour. Feel free to send us emails, and we look forward to hearing from you from Child Maltreatment in a variety of capacities.
Thank you, Vincent. Thank you so much, Dr. Palusci and all our editors. And thank you everyone for being here. And please tune in to our next Zoom chat. Miss Christy, I know she puts the link to all of our training opportunities, and you can sign up there.